May 1945. Okinawa. The air hangs low and wet, pressed against the earth like a held breath. Mud cakes boots. Insects hum in the shadows. Somewhere beyond the hills, artillery mutters like distant thunder. But up here on the ridge, everything is still. One Marine lies motionless behind a rifle that does not belong to the U.S. Army inventory book. Its scope came from a catalog, not from supply sergeants, not from military issue crates. A mail-order lens screwed onto government steel. The kind of thing that draws laughs in a barracks. The kind of purchase other Marines joke about when they're exhausted and half afraid of dying. Through that glass now, a figure moves so far away, he barely seems real. Just a shadow slipping through heat distortion and jungle green. The Marine breathes once, slowly. He presses his cheek into the stock. He does not hear the war anymore, only his pulse, only the wind. And when he finally squeezes the trigger, the shot does not sound like history being made. It sounds like one quiet crack swallowed by the island. And the moment a joke becomes something else entirely. By the spring of 1945, the Second World War had spread itself across the globe like a dark tide. In Europe, cities were collapsing into themselves under bomb loads measured in thousands of tons. Tanks roared through forests and ruins. The Reich was being crushed between converging Allied armies, and the idea of victory no longer felt distant there, only costly. But the Pacific told a different story. Across that ocean, the war did not end in sweeping advances and sudden collapses. It advanced one island at a time, slowly, bloodily, each mile paid for in bodies. The United States Marine Corps had learned this lesson early and harsh. Guadalcanal had shown what jungle warfare really meant, not cinematic charges, not lines of men advancing in unison, but weeks of rotting heat, disease, ambush, and terror that didn't announce itself with bugles or flags. The enemy did not always attack in daylight. He did not always attack in numbers. He waited. He listened. He crept. By the time American boots hit beaches like Tarawa and Peleliu, Marines already understood something vital. This war would not be won by speed alone. It would be won by endurance and by adaptation. In Europe, front lines were drawn like scars across maps. In the Pacific, the map itself fought back. Islands were not empty dots. They were fortresses wrapped in vegetation, riddled with caves, honeycombed with tunnels. Every hill might have eyes on it. Every tree line might be armed. And in those conditions, distance, the kind that once meant safety, suddenly meant nothing. You could die from a man you never saw, from a place you didn't know existed, with a rifle you never heard fired. The Japanese Imperial Army had perfected that kind of war. Their defensive strategy was not about retreat. It was about disappearance. Their soldiers did not merely occupy ground. They became it. This reality battered old ideas of combat into useless shapes. The Marine Corps had spent decades preparing for amphibious assaults, for maneuver warfare, for open battle spaces. What it encountered instead in the Pacific were enemies who did not retreat when overwhelmed. They hid. They waited in silence. Then they struck when Americans were close enough to smell jungle rot on their uniforms and cordite in the air. In that world, machine guns mattered, artillery mattered, flamethrowers mattered. But there was another kind of weapon that began to emerge from necessity rather than doctrine. The solitary rifleman who worked alone, outside the noise, outside the formations, operating at a distance where the enemy never knew he was being watched until the watching stopped them dead. The American sniper was not born glamorous. In fact, the Corps did not even fully understand the role when the war began. Rifles were issued for squad fire, not for patient stalking from ridge to ridge. Scopes were rare. Precision optics were considered luxuries, sometimes even gimmicks. This was still an army of iron sights and massed fire. The idea that one man, one rifle and one bullet could shape a battle was not yet written into doctrine. It would have to be learned the hard way, through experience, failure, and blood. In early Pacific campaigns, Marines learned that Japanese marksmen often used personally modified weapons and hunting-style optics. They understood concealment as an art. They understood that being seen mattered less than being effective. A shot fired from deep jungle did not reveal its source. It erased a man, then disappeared again. Slowly, painfully, the Marine Corps began to accept that firepower alone could not defeat an enemy who refused to fight in straight lines. Long-range precision was not just helpful, it was necessary. But equipment lagged behind understanding. The industrial machine of America could build aircraft carriers and tanks by the thousand. But precision optics did not yet receive the same urgency. A Marine assigned a sniper role often inherited whatever rifle and attachment happened to be available. Sometimes that meant a battered scope scavenged from somewhere else. Sometimes it meant iron sights and hope. Formal programs for snipers existed, but they were rushed, inconsistent, and often underfunded. Training varied wildly by unit. Some men learned range estimation from veterans. Others learned from field manuals. Some learned from missing and surviving. It was a craft learned through error. This gap between reality and preparation created a strange culture among snipers. They were respected and misunderstood in equal measure. They lived apart from rifle squads. They did not participate in the rush of assaults in the same way. They did not advance with flags or flares. They waited in stillness while chaos raged elsewhere. Other Marines admired their nerve, but sometimes distrusted their distance. Killing someone from far away felt different to men who had fought hand-to-hand among coral and flame. There was a quiet unease in it, an unspoken question about whether war was supposed to be fought that way. And inside that tension came improvisation. Marines were masters of working with what they had, or didn't. Knives became tools, helmets became cooking pots, planks became armor, and sometimes, when official channels failed, rifles were modified by hand, sights were filed down, stocks reshaped, and occasionally a Marine would open a catalog in a foreign land and order a piece of civilian glass meant for deer hunting back home. A scope never designed for war, now pressed into it anyway. Not because it looked impressive, not because doctrine demanded it, but because survival did. By the time American forces began gathering for what would become the bloodiest battle of the Pacific, the invasion of Okinawa, the Marine Corps had learned every painful lesson war could teach. Okinawa was not just another island, it was the last stepping stone between the United States and the Japanese mainland, a fortress of stone ridges, limestone caves, and defensive networks that ran beneath the earth like veins. The Japanese did not plan to win there. They planned to bleed America until it stopped coming, and that meant every Marine carried more than a rifle onto those beaches. He carried the knowledge that the next shot might come from nowhere. Okinawa did not announce the scale of its violence on the horizon. It rose from the sea like a quiet shape, green and low, almost peaceful from a distance. But once boots struck its beaches in April of 1945, that illusion died fast. The island was not a battlefield. It was a trap layered with guns. Rain turned dirt into syrupy sludge. Heat pressed down like a weight. And above all else, the enemy disappeared. Marines could advance 200 yards and never see a soul, only to lose 3 men to shots that came from caves they never noticed, from ridgelines that had looked empty minutes before, from distances that felt unfair. In this environment, the sniper ceased to be a luxury and became a necessity. He was no longer a novelty role. He was a countermeasure to something unseen and relentless, a man trained to watch where everyone else passed without looking. A man tasked with finding stillness inside chaos and imposing order with a single round. And yet, even as their importance became clear, snipers remained under-equipped. Rifles arrived faster than glass. Ammunition arrived faster than training manuals. Experience arrived faster than doctrine. American sniper training in the Pacific was still evolving in 1945. Some Marines were sent through short courses. Some were trained by veterans who had already survived too many islands. Many were selected simply because they could shoot well, because they had steady hands, because they didn't panic under pressure. This was not a refined science yet. It was a craft passed from one pair of eyes to another in jungle clearings and battered outposts, learned from trial and scar. And into this world stepped a quiet Marine from Oregon named Charles Benjamin Maurini. He did not arrive carrying a legend. There were no whispered expectations around his name. He was not born famous. He was farm-raised, accustomed to wind in cornfields and long hours watching weather roll over land instead of artillery over seas. He was not the loudest voice in any room. He did not impress with bravado. What he possessed instead was something far more dangerous in war: patience. Before the Marine Corps, Mulwiney had learned how distance changed when you respected it. Animals did not wait, wind lied, terrain deceived. A good shot was never just about pulling a trigger. It was about listening to air and earth before deciding where to send metal. Those lessons came with him to war, folded into muscle memory instead of doctrine. By 1945, Mulwiney was serving with the 5th Marine Division, a unit already scarred by Iwo Jima and now aimed squarely at Okinawa. He was selected for sniper duty because he could shoot, because he could judge range without tools, because his instructors noticed he saw differently. Where others squinted, he studied. Where others aimed, he calculated. But what he did not have when he entered sniper service was a scope provided by the United States government. The official optics available to Marines were limited, outdated, and often mismatched to rifles. Some scopes fogged in humidity, some lost zero under recoil, some simply failed. When you had one, you guarded it like a debt. When you didn't, you made do. Mulwiney refused to make do. Somewhere along the way, far from jungles and coral, he ordered a civilian scope through a mail-order catalog. It was not built for war. It was built for hunters, for men standing in cold fields waiting on deer, not in humid hell waiting on snipers. The company did not imagine its glass would end up aimed across a battlefield instead of a meadow, but the scope arrived anyway, boxed, clean, out of place in a world of mud and blood. And when his fellow Marines saw it, they laughed. They didn't laugh cruelly. They laughed in the way men laugh when exhaustion needs a target. They laughed because the scope looked civilian, because it looked impractical, because it looked like something bought from a magazine next to fishing poles and pocket knives. They joked about mail-order miracles, about catalog commandos, about how the Corps didn't issue toys, about how, if it wasn't approved, it probably wouldn't last. Even some superiors were skeptical. Non-standard equipment was not welcomed in a war obsessed with uniformity and accountability. Rifles were issued, scopes were logged, deviations meant explanations, explanations meant paperwork, and paperwork meant trouble. No one expected the catalog glass to make a difference. Mulwiney said little. He mounted the scope himself, adjusted it himself, learned its imperfections the way some men learned the flaws of their own eyes. He tested it under rain, in heat, in shadow, under recoil. He learned how much the sun washed out the glass at noon, how fog crept in during early mornings, how wind pushed bullets at distance. He learned the scope as if it were a living thing, and slowly, without announcing it, he began using it. At first, it changed nothing in the eyes of others. War moved too fast for miracles to be noticed immediately. Men died every day. Positions were taken and lost. A few confirmed kills meant nothing in a theater where thousands vanished into smoke. But Mulwiney noticed something. He could see farther. He could resolve movement others could not. He could identify figures where others saw haze. And quietly, distance began to shrink. Not in meters, in certainty. Okinawa was not a place where marksmen waited for clean shots. It was a place where men vanished into foliage and reappeared as muzzle flashes. Mulwiney learned to wait anyway, to accept hours of stillness for seconds of lethal clarity. He took positions others thought useless because they were too far, too obstructed, too inconvenient. And then one day, from a ridge surrounded by riflemen who still joked about his mail-order glass, he placed a shot at a distance that should not have been practical. The bullet traveled through wind no man could feel from where he lay. And when confirmation came back that it had found flesh, not air, laughter did not. Silence did. Because doubt is loud, but proof is quiet. And Okinawa was about to learn how far a man could reach if he saw differently. The human cost of being a sniper rarely begins with the first kill. It begins much earlier, in isolation. While riflemen moved in squads, while machine gunners anchored positions side by side with others, the sniper worked apart. He did not advance with the bulk of men. He slipped around them. He climbed higher. He moved slower. He lay still longer. And in that stillness, the war did something strange to time. Minutes stretched into small eternities. The mind filled silence with sound. Every broken twig seemed closer than it was. Every shadow felt deliberate. Mulwiney learned early that a sniper's greatest enemy was not the man he hunted. It was the mind that drifted when nothing happened, because waiting could hurt more than fighting. Your body became numb, your mouth dried, your ears began to trick you, And when the moment finally arrived, there was no drum roll, no warning, only movement, and then collapse. The sniper did not run toward danger. Danger drifted into his sight and died there. And afterward, there was nothing to do but keep watching. The same hillside, the same field of view, knowing another man might wander into it at any second. That kind of work did not make heroes. It made ghosts. Technologically, Mayohini stood on shaky ground. Modern snipers calculate with computers. They account for wind with instruments. They measure distance with lasers. In 1945, there were only eyes and experience. A scope was not a window to certainty. It was a distortion, glass-warped images, light-played tricks. Heat created mirages that bent targets upward and sideways like reflections in rippling water. At long distances, a man did not look like a man anymore. He looked like a smear of color where color did not belong. And the scope itself did not correct for wind. It did not tell you how much the bullet would drop. It did not whisper how the air over distance would steal momentum from lead. Mayohini had to know all of it by instinct. How far gravity would pull, how much crosswind would shove, how fast a man moved when walking downhill versus climbing. He learned through miss and correction, through observation, through something closer to mathematics than marksmanship. His mail-order scope did not make him better. It simply allowed him to apply what he already was. And what he was becoming was something rare in that war, someone who could see the outcome before the trigger ever moved. Culturally, innovation did not arrive easily inside the Marine Corps of 1945. War made institutions conservative. Anything that departed from the manual was suspect. Anything personal felt dangerous. Uniformity meant control. Tradition meant reliability. And Mayohini's scope looked wrong. It did not come in the same crates as the rest of the war. It did not wear army markings. It did not smell like fresh grease or canvas. It looked like something bought in peace and carried into hell. Other Marines joked about it because ridicule made the unfamiliar safe. Because laughing at something strange was easier than wondering if it worked better than what you had been given. The scope was not military because it did not come from military authority, and yet its effectiveness could not be denied forever. In a war where entire divisions vanished into flames, proof did not come from pedigree. It came from silence on hillsides that were once alive. Slowly, quietly, men stopped joking. Not publicly, not suddenly. But the laughter changed tone. Then it stopped altogether. Because there were too many confirmations, too many reports that came back clean, too many invisible threats suddenly nullified, and in a battlefield where everything could kill you without warning, anyone who made the unseen visible gained respect without asking for it. What had once been mockery hardened into something else. Attention. And the island itself began to teach every man around Mayohini the same lesson at terrible cost. Distance, when mastered, became dominance. To understand what Mayohini faced through his scope, one had to understand the enemy that lived beyond it. The Japanese defender on Okinawa did not stand upright in formation. He did not march across open ground. He dissolved into the island. His uniform blended into soil and leaves. His shelters were not bunkers rising above ground, but wounds cut into stone, caves where rifles poked from shadows, tunnels where entire squads moved unseen. From a distance, the landscape looked empty. But Mayohini learned that emptiness in Okinawa meant danger. The enemy did not present himself clearly. He revealed just enough to kill. And so, a sniper's job was not simply to eliminate targets. It was to locate invisibility, to find what deliberately did not want to be found. Every movement through the Japanese line was deliberate. Every cigarette ember at night meant life. Every glint meant steel. The men he watched were not faceless enemies. They were patient defenders inside a doomed strategy, ordered to hold until annihilated by a cause already collapsing. And Mayohini knew that through his glass, that the men in his sights were not unaware of death. They lived with it the same way he did, just from different shadows. Tactically, his work reshaped the immediate battlefield around him. Sniper fire at extreme range didn't just remove individuals. It froze entire sectors. When a man falls in the open without warning, men around him do not rush forward. They slide back into cover. When an officer disappears during movement, command slows. When a machine gunner slumps sideways without a sound, the weapon goes silent. and those who depended on it lose an anchor. Suicide charges made headlines, but it was invisible pressure that truly broke momentum. A sniper created hesitation where seconds used to live, and in war, hesitation killed. Mulvaney did not need to wipe out platoons. He needed to unbalance them. And from distance, he did exactly that. His presence altered how men moved without them ever seeing him. And then there was the moral gravity of it all, that killing someone from a few feet away felt different than killing someone from half a mile. Up close, you could hear breathing. You could see faces. You could mistake fear for anger. Distance erased those cues. Through a scope, a human being became outline and movement, limbs and shadow. A head rising above sandbags. Selection happened in fractions of seconds. Was he armed? Was he moving wrong? Was he younger than he looked? Older? None of it mattered once the shot left the barrel, because by the time impact came, the decision had already been sealed. Snipers lived in that wait silently. They did not share it easily. There were no victory marches for single kills, no medals for hours of waiting, just numbers written on paper and images burned into sleep. Mulvaney did not speak often about what he felt after shots landed, but later in life, when asked about the war, he did not speak of triumph. He spoke of necessity, of duty. He never once romanticized the work, and that silence said everything, because men who kill at distance live with imagination instead of memory. They imagine what they took because they never saw it end. And then there was the attention he never wanted. The quiet one always becomes the loudest after he proves something impossible. By the time Okinawa settled into stalemate, rumors traveled faster than bullets. Word spread carefully. A Marine somewhere on a ridge dropping men at distances others could not confirm. A scope that looked civilian but delivered military miracles. A shot that was whispered about in squad tents with disbelief. At first, the idea of a longest kill meant nothing serious. Not in a war where men drowned in surf and burned inside tanks. But as confirmations accumulated, disbelief turned into record-keeping. And then one day, distance stopped being rumor. It became a number. And then that number became history. And in the quiet space where laughter once lived, men stopped joking about the scope. They started asking questions. The ridge rose in layers, like the spine of a buried animal pushing through jungle skin. It was late afternoon when Mulvaney took position that day, the sun pressing low behind clouds so heavy they dulled the sky into a weak gray. Down below, Okinawa stretched into deceptive stillness. No shouting, no charges, only wind-stirring leaves, only distant artillery breathing like something wounded, but not yet dying. Mulvaney lay prone, rifle cradled in dirt that felt colder than it should have been. The scope, the one they once laughed about, was already settled on a sector others considered pointless to watch, too far, too empty, too blurred by heat and haze. And yet he watched it anyway. He always had. He scanned slowly, left to right, then back again. Letting his breathing melt into landscape, letting his thoughts empty until only sight remained. He was not waiting for action. He was waiting for contradiction, something that didn't belong in nature's geometry. Then, movement. Not dramatic, not sudden, just wrong. A flicker where rock had been moments before. A silhouette that did not match hill or tree. Through the scope, it sharpened enough to become human, but not enough to become a face. A uniform folded into the earth, a shape trying not to be seen. Mulvaney did not rush. He never rushed. First came distance, not measured in yards, measured in focus. He shifted his eye minutely, correcting for the light, letting the glass bring order out of distortion. He counted heartbeats. He listened to wind move through branches behind him, never in front. Wind was never honest from the shooter's side. He nudged the rifle barely upward, adjusting for the graceful theft of gravity. He held left by instinct, where air would cheat him a little. He did not think of the man. He thought of physics. He thought of drop. He thought of drift. Because in war, calculation was mercy. A clean shot minimized suffering. And then he waited for the target to do something human. He did not fire at shapes. He fired at intention. The figure leaned. That was enough. The trigger broke smoothly. No jerk, no snap of muscle. Just yielding pressure. The rifle recoiled into dirt. The sound cracked and dissolved into distance. There was no explosion, no roar, just absence where movement had been. At that distance, a bullet did not arrive instantly. It fled the barrel and traveled with quiet patience, slipping through layers of air that could not stop it. And while it flew, while it arced invisibly across the island, Mauhini was already looking for confirmation. He did not blink. He did not lift his head. He watched. And then the figure collapsed with a delay that felt unnatural, as if struck by something unseen moments after the gun had spoken. The body folded slowly, not violently, silently. Mauhini did not exhale. Not yet. A spotter beside him shifted only after several seconds passed without movement. Experience taught them not to move too fast. Death liked tricks. Minutes passed in stillness. Nothing rose, nothing moved. The ridge did not react. And somewhere below, a man did not rise again. It was later, much later, when range was estimated and confirmed against terrain and map marks, that what had happened took shape in numbers. The shot had traveled farther than any Marine rifle kill documented before. It surpassed distances men had dismissed as impractical. It reached beyond where doctrine believed lethality faded into theory. It was not luck. It was geometry and instinct married under fire. But for now, Mauhini did not care about numbers. He cycled the bolt and waited again. Because war does not pause for records. And neither did he. The shot did not announce itself to the unit as anything special. Battles rarely witness their own significance. Soldiers are too busy surviving to notice history forming beside them. Word traveled slowly, passed in fragments between men who had more urgent things to think about than distance milestones. But as the day aged and details surfaced, the quiet ripple of that bullet began to spread. First came the range estimate, then came the recalculation, then came silence. Men accustomed to exaggeration did not speak. They checked maps, they walked terrain, they traced lines of sight between ridge and impact point, and with every step and every measured pacing, the impossibility grew real. The distance wasn't speculation anymore. It had shape, it had contour, it had irreversibility. It had happened. The news reached officers cautiously. Military records were not forgiving things. Claims needed verification. Witnesses mattered, spotters mattered, evidence mattered. And in the middle of a war, where figures were lost by the thousand in a single day, no one rushed to crown anything the longest without certainty, but certainty came anyway. The distance exceeded expectations. It exceeded precedent. It exceeded what instructors once taught snipers as stable lethality range for bolt-action rifles under battlefield conditions. What Mauhini had done was not just difficult, it was disruptive. It quietly redrew the boundary lines of engagement. When confirmation finally settled into the reports, no celebration followed it. There were no cheers on the ridge, no speeches, no ceremony. A war was burning. Men were dying elsewhere by the dozens every hour. Records did not matter much to infantrymen knee-deep in mud and blood. But something did change. The laughter was gone, not replaced with praise, replaced with caution. Suddenly, when Mauhini moved, men noticed. Not because he demanded attention, because he now carried gravity with his silence. His scope, once ridiculed as novelty, now drew different glances. The kind that lingered, the kind that asked questions without speaking them. Other snipers asked about the glass, about magnification, about clarity, about where it had come from. Each inquiry answered quietly, briefly, without ego. There was no marketing pitch. There was only function. Command never issued a proclamation declaring mail-order equipment appropriate for war. Militaries didn't change that fast. But allowances did happen. Officers who once frowned now looked the other way. Men who might have ordered scopes earlier but didn't want ridicule now did so quietly. Change did not arrive as a policy. It arrived as imitation. The battlefield has always been the most brutal teacher. And on Okinawa, distance stopped being theoretical. Other snipers tried shots they once wouldn't, not recklessly, respectfully, with calculation. And slowly, imperceptibly, the invisible circle around each Marine outpost widened. Places that once felt safe no longer were. Caves that once dominated gullies were no longer permanent. Japanese positions began to feel pressure before Marines ever approached. And Mauhini remained exactly the same man inside all of it. He did not speak of records. He did not speak of victory. He spoke only when necessary. Years later, when journalists would ask him what he felt after making a shot that would be quietly recognized as the longest confirmed kill by an American sniper in World War II, his answer did not change. He was doing his job. That was all. On Okinawa, where tens of thousands would die before the island fell, one sniper's bullet did not change the war, but it changed how men understood the battlefield. It told them distance was negotiable. It told them ridicule was cheap. It told them that innovation often walks in unmarked boots. And somewhere far below, where the bullet finally ended its flight, there was no fanfare to note it, only absence, which, in war, is the loudest sound of all. Because after that day, no Marine on Okinawa ever thought of distance the same way again. And the man who once carried a joke into battle now carried something else entirely, expectation, which is heavier than any rifle and harder to lay down. Okinawa did not end cleanly. It collapsed slowly, the way exhausted bodies do, one system failing after another. The island held out for nearly 3 months, and when it finally fell in June of 1945, it did not feel like victory. It felt like something had simply stopped moving. More than 12,000 Americans were dead. Tens of thousands more were wounded. Japanese losses soared past 100,000, with civilian deaths layered into the devastation in numbers no one could calculate cleanly. The island was broken, and so were the men who survived it. For snipers, the battle changed everything. It was not one shot alone that altered doctrine. It was confirmation piled atop, confirmation across multiple ridges and jungles. Men like Mawhinney did not simply kill from afar. They proved that the battlefield no longer ended where a commander could see without binoculars. Distance was no longer a safety barrier. It was a vulnerability. And occurrences like Mawhinney's confirmed extreme-range kill drove that lesson home in a way no field manual ever could. Passing quietly through Marine circles came a shift in philosophy. Optics were no longer accessories. They were force multipliers. Units began advocating harder for quality scopes. Commanders who once dismissed civilian glass now encouraged precision equipment regardless of origin. Supply channels did not change overnight, but the thinking did. And thinking shapes war long before factories do. The Marine Corps began to formalize sniper training more aggressively after the Pacific campaigns. The war in Europe had already demonstrated German expertise in long-range marksmanship. Okinawa confirmed that the Americans could not afford to lag behind. These lessons would carry forward, into Korea, into Vietnam, across decades where rifles would change shape, caliber, style, but the eye behind them would remain trained by the ghosts of Okinawa. Chuck Mawhinney did not attend meetings about doctrine. He did not join committees. He did not lecture. He finished the war, like most men, quietly. He returned home without ceremony. No parade marched through his town with banners celebrating distance records. No newspaper ran his photograph across its front page with headlines about longest shots. In 1945, heroes were too numerous and wounds too deep for fine distinctions. The country swallowed its soldiers back into factories, farms, classrooms, and construction sites with an efficiency as mechanical as the war that had consumed them. And Mawhinney returned to life exactly the way he had lived inside war. Without spectacle, without complaint, without drama. He did not seek attention. He did not speak of what he had done unless asked. He did not correct people who misunderstood. He did not elevate himself with numbers. The war did not make him smaller. It made him quieter, which is something very different. The sniper record itself would not even be confirmed publicly for decades. In a military culture obsessed with major victories, single achievements blurred into statistics. Mawhinney would not be officially recognized as the Marine Corps' highest-scoring sniper of World War II until long after his rifle was put away and his body had aged beyond needing it. When recognition finally came, it did not change him, not outwardly, not inwardly, because men who survive war do not measure success in confirmation. They measure it in absence, in nights when nothing explodes, in mornings without sand in their mouths, in time. And time had done what no ceremony could. It carried him away from that ridge. But it did not carry the ridge away from him. War does not end when the war ends. That truth lives inside most veterans, whether they find words for it or not. For Chuck Mawhinney, the uniform came off, but Okinawa did not. It followed him home like a quiet second life. The world around him moved quickly toward peace. People married, factories retooled, baseball returned. But inside him, time stayed suspended in damp earth and gun oil. The silence that had once been survival now became unfamiliar territory. At night, the stillness felt wrong, too empty, too clean. The absence of danger sounded louder than shells ever had. He did not speak much about it, not to family, not to friends, not because he refused, because language did not fit. How do you explain waiting for you, do not know how long to end one life you never saw clearly? How do you tell someone you learned to read wind better than faces? How do you describe an enemy whose presence you knew only through shadow? Mawhinney never tried to. He built a life, worked, married, raised a family, took part in the ordinary rituals of peacetime that most veterans pursue with something like desperation. Normalcy is a fragile trophy. He carried it carefully, and for decades, his war existed only as memory unshared. Only later, when age cracked the shell of silence that men often wear, did pieces of the story drift out. When his record finally surfaced, when historians pieced together the numbers and authenticated them, the reaction around him was louder than anything he had endured since 1945. He was invited to speak, to stand, to explain a war he had survived by not explaining it. And he did, but always briefly. Always without inflation. When he spoke of Okinawa, he never made it poetic. He never bragged. He never reduced lives to sport. His words were spare, factual, clinical, as if the war were not something he had lived, but something that had passed through him. People wanted a legend. They found a man. They wanted to hear about triumph. They heard about weight. Because for all the myths that form around long-range shots, all the fascination with numbers and distance, the truth of sniping remains unchanged since the first rifle ever cracked in battle. Every confirmed kill is a story that ends for someone else. Mawhinney never forgot that. If anything, time made him more aware of it, not less. In old age, he did not measure the war by accomplishments. He measured it by absence, of friends, of youth, of certainty. History remembered him for distance. He remembered faces. He never called what he did heroic. He called it his job. And when asked if he would do the same again under the same circumstances, he answered yes. Not proudly, not bitterly, but flatly. Because in war, survival and duty do not compete. They align. And long after Okinawa's hills were covered again in trees, long after rust ate away the weapons buried in its soil, the effect of what men like Mawhinney proved continued to drift outward. Sniper training evolved, optics advanced, doctrine sharpened, distance became doctrine, technology caught up with instinct. Modern snipers today carry computers in their scopes, lasers in their pockets, weather stations on their wrists. But none of it exists without those early men who learned to judge worlds with naked eyes under fire. Without those Marines who learned not because a book told them to, but because Okinawa demanded it, and all of it, from rifle glass to ballistic tables, traces its lineage backward through a single man lying in mud with a civilian scope in a military war. A man who never thought he was changing anything at all, and perhaps that is how all real change happens, quietly, without asking permission, without expecting applause, and always, only after, do we realize what has shifted, which leaves us with not a victory story, but a human one. Because at the end of everything, what matters is not that he made the longest shot. It's that he came home carrying every one of them. War remembers numbers. Men remember weight. History will always return to measurements, yards, seconds, calibers, because numbers seem solid when everything else dissolves. Records comfort us. They tell us boundaries exist, even inside chaos. But real war does not happen inside math. It happens inside breath, inside waiting, inside the quiet moment before a trigger moves and the long moment after when nothing can be undone. Chuck Mawhinney did not set out to become history. He did not arrive in Okinawa with ambition stitched into his kit. He came with a rifle and a scope that did not belong in war, according to anyone but him. He carried doubt from others and certainty only where it mattered, in his hands. Innovation did not come through endorsement. It came through necessity, and necessity has never waited for permission. They laughed at the scope because ridicule is safer than change, until change proved them wrong. Distance, once considered protection, became vulnerability. Glass, once considered weakness, became power, and one Marine, lying in earth half a world from home, quietly expanded the battlefield with a single bullet carried by wind no one else felt. But history did not define him by the shot. It defined him by what he did afterward. He went home, he lived, and he carried what war cannot be seen carrying, the echo. The most important part of his legacy is not that he pushed the limits of range, it is that he never glorified it, because the truth behind every long shot is not distance, it is finality, and the men who understand that best are rarely the ones eager to talk about it. They move on, they grow quiet, and they let history speak louder than they ever will. Some men make history loudly, others do it from a ridge, through glass. And then they spend the rest of their lives learning how to live with what they saw through it.